First off, I just want to thank everyone for coming out today. This is a massive showing, and I really appreciate all the support we have in this community. We've had some absolutely amazing, beautiful talks today, and I look forward to Rick Strassman's speech, the breathwork ceremony, just everything that's coming up. And right now, it's truly my honor to introduce one of the heroes of the psychedelic community, one of the only doctors who has ever studied and researched DMT legally. I'd like to introduce Rick Strassman. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks for coming. Nice turnout. It's great. So this is the first talk I've given in 5 years. Sure. So I've got to hand it to the organizers for drawing me out of my cave. Yeah, I unplugged it. Sorry. Okay, that's good. Great, thanks. Okay, so I've got a lot of slides and a lot of material, so I'll just get started and see how far we get. So I want to give a big, thanks to the organizers, to the university, and to all of you for attending. I couldn't quite tell what to call this place. Is it Colorado University or the University of Colorado? And so I went back to my hotel and just wrote university on this slide. So I came this morning and I attended, most of this morning's lectures. And the one word that came to my mind while I was listening to everybody was courage. I mean, people are crazy courageous to be talking about what they're talking about and doing what they're doing. So just want to, hand it to everybody for, carrying the torch and trying to advance the species. If you have questions or, if you want copies of my slides, feel free to contact me. That's my email address and my website, because there's quite a few slides and there's a lot of information in them. Oh, and so after my presentation this evening, I'm going to be selling and signing books too, so I can chat with people individually then as well. So the guiding principles, for the work after I completed my DMT study 20 years ago now, were the words of two mentors. One was a psychiatrist, Daniel Friedman, whose mantra about psychedelics were, if, so what? If DMT, causes these effects, so what? What's it good for? What does it mean? What can we learn from it? And another mentor was Dr. Willis Harman, who founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And the comment that he made to me one afternoon was that we had to, at the very least, enlarge the discussion about psychedelics. So at that time, that was in the early 90s, it was purely the brain chemistry model, some of the psychotherapy work. Those two ideas have been prompting me to continue with this work in a direction that some people have found surprising, and I suppose I ended up feeling as surprised as anybody else. So quite a few of the speakers have reviewed the psychedelic drugs. And they modify every component of consciousness, perception, emotion, mood, somatic body sensations, mental processes, cognition, volition, and will, sense of self. So one thing that people have spoken about is considerations in what to call these drugs. And there's a number of considerations, scientific versus popular, political correctness, and the baggage which has accrued. But the most important, I think, is accuracy. So the most common terms are psychedelic. The next most common term and the most common term you'll come across in the medical and the legal literature is hallucinogen. A more common expression is entheogen. And some older ones or more obscure ones are terms like psychotomimetic, consciousness or mind expanding, psychointegrators, or empathogens or entactogens. So the one which is the most common is the term psychedelic. Oh, okay. Let's see. Okay, there it is. Yeah. Because it's the most generic term, I think it is the most accurate. Because these drugs can do anything. So quite a bit can happen. Maybe not much might happen at all. It might be good, might be bad, might be spiritual, might be boring. It's got a lot of accrued cultural and political baggage, but I think it's the most accurate term. So the next most common term is hallucinogen. But that's kind of a loaded term because voices, so visions and the voices aren't invariant, and it kind of begs the question regarding what is a hallucination, and it also, I think, overall judges the state as pathological, and the experience or what you're perceiving as unreal. So a more common term is entheogen, but I think that's kind of limiting as well, because what happens if you don't believe in spirituality or divinity? Can an atheist or a radical materialist have an entheogenic experience, and would they even want to take one in the first place? It would kind of close off a significant segment of people that might be interested in these substances. Psychotomimetic we can dispense with. It's not anything anybody would ever want to take. But still, it is being used in the European literature and especially the German literature. It's kind of interesting how that term has lingered. So there's the expression, consciousness expanding or mind expanding, but I think that kind of is a pigeonholing kind of term too, because your mind might contract. It's important to use your words carefully. Obviously, so that's why I'm kind of belaboring the point. So Michael Winkelmann, developed an expression, psychointegrator, but it's the same problem. Your mind, may disintegrate instead. Let's see. So Dave Nichols, developed the term entactogen or empathogen, in other words, to increase or to generate empathy or feeling connected with people, and so he developed that term with respect to MDMA and related compounds, but those aren't really the classical psychedelics like DMT and psilocybin, LSD, mescaline. And also, they kind of limit the kind of experience you may have, because you because you may not feel especially empathic or related to the people that you're with. So I prefer the term psychedelic, and it still is the most popular, especially in this kind of a group. And it's also making inroads into the scientific into the scientific literature to a greater extent as well. So there's all kinds of applications of the psychedelic, drug state. The one I'll be emphasizing this evening is from the perspective of religion and spirituality. But obviously there's quite a few other, fields which can be enhanced through the application of that state, and our understanding of that state can be enhanced through the application of that discipline. So it's kind of a, bidirectional, dynamic. The state can be understood through psychology, and psychology can be enlarged through the application and study of that state. So there's creativity, there's art, brain function, cultural kinds of issues, even cosmology. So DMT, a topic near and dear to my heart. So DMT stands for dimethyltryptamine. It's chemically related to melatonin and serotonin. It's naturally occurring, and it is made in plants. So it is made in plants and it's made in animals. In other words, it's endogenous. It's been studied for quite a long time, and it was actually, determined, 60 years ago that it was made in the lungs. And even though I speculated in my first DMT book about it being made in the pineal, that wasn't established until just a couple of years ago. So it was, first discovered in psychedelic, plants in the 1940s, and then was discovered to be psychoactive in the 1950s, and then it was, then it was determined, to exist in the body fluids and the body tissues of, mammals. I think starting off with, it began with rabbits and then rodents. Mice and rats, and then it was discovered in humans. Spinal fluid, blood, and urine. So one of the very interesting things about DMT is that DMT in the blood is transported into the brain across the blood-brain barrier, and there's only very few compounds that the brain treats that way. Like usually these are critical compounds for brain function, such as blood sugar. So it's as if the brain requires, DMT for normal function. So normal function of the brain, means normal consciousness. So you can think of a narrow window of DMT levels in the brain being, necessary, for the, cohesion of everyday, consciousness. So more specifically, a couple of years ago in Wisconsin, a group there discovered that the genetic apparatus for making DMT is active in the retina as well. So even, more to the point that, DMT, naturally occurring, may modify everyday consciousness. It may specifically play a role in visual consciousness. When you're talking about are the DMT, beings real or not real, what's the DMT, world? Is it subjective or objective? When you think about, the brain requiring DMT perhaps, and, the retina producing DMT, I think that, that distinction starts to break down somewhat. So despite, all the things by Joe Rogan, we don't really know these things. We don't really know if, DMT levels increase at birth or death. So I speculate about those things in my DMT book, but I don't think I, made the distinction that, as clear as I could have regarding what's speculation and, what is known. Also, we don't know if, normal concentrations in the body increase in non-drug states that resemble DMT states, like, so like near-death experiences or dreams, meditation, contact experiences with aliens. And also, I get an email probably once a week about somebody's got a calcified pineal, and they're working on decalcifying their pineal, and they want to let me know how it's going. So there are no data that pineal calcification has any like effect on anything other than perhaps melatonin concentrations go down. Yeah, and we can't really decalcify the pineal. There's just no way to do that. I suppose you could use ultrasound, but that would be kind of scary. Okay. I'm sorry, there's we don't know if DMT does. Well, we don't really know yet. There were some old, data, from the 50s demonstrating that DMT, kind of, sits between, the two helices in DNA. It's called intercalation. But that was only one study that I know about, and it's almost 60 years old. So, like with respect to transcription or gene activity, I'm just not sure. That's a good research question. So after DMT was discovered in the human body, people were interested in its relationship to psychosis, and so the emphasis of the first wave of studies was on the relationship between schizophrenia and concentrations of DMT in the blood compared to normals, differential responsiveness in schizophrenics to DMT compared to normal responses, and there were some early attempts to blockade DMT synthesis in schizophrenics in order to modify their symptoms, but those projects never got off the ground after the Controlled Substances Act. So my study took place at the University of New Mexico Medical School. We started in 1990, ended in 1995. We studied about 60 normal volunteers. We gave it intravenously. It was a dose-response study. We gave a number of small doses, medium doses, and large doses. And I took careful notes, and we drew a lot of blood. The next study after that was a tolerance study. We were trying to see if the response to DMT diminished with repeated dosing. So we gave a large dose every half hour, 4 times in the space of a morning. And so that was a wild study. So people didn't develop tolerance. They got, as stoned the 4th time as they did the first. So also we were interested in, characterizing the specific subtype of the serotonin receptor mediating some of the effects. And we gave a lot of DMT over those 5 years, almost 400 doses. So as quite a few of you know, when you take a full dose of DMT, it starts to work very quickly. There's a rush of inner pressure and acceleration. And then within a minute or so, there's the experience of the separation of the mind and body. And you enter into a world of bright, rapidly moving light. Your sense of self is maintained. There's not really very often a merging with a white light. There's intense emotion sometimes, sometimes there's not much emotion at all. And it's usually, contains some intelligences of some sort or another, more or less, recognizable. They may look, kind of humanoid or reptilian or bird-like, mammalian, robotic. Even furniture could, seem, to possess an intelligence and a sentience. Even the patterns, seem to contain intelligence. The unformed, visual patterns. And it's quite highly interactive. It isn't like you're just, kind of unified with anything. You're dealing with all that stuff out there. It's dealing with you. You're dealing with it. There's a lot of give and take. You're able to control your awareness. It isn't a passive state in as much as you're immobilized, but your mind is active and kind of determining what's going on around you. So, since I stopped my work 20 years ago, I've been, thinking about it, obviously, most of the time. And so one of the, things that has been helpful in thinking about the spiritual or the religious, properties of these, substances, or of any spiritual experience is to dichotomize them between, what I call a mystical unitive state and an interactive relational one. In the mystical unitive state, there's no perceptions or verbal content. The sense of self dissolves into the white light or the ground of being or emptiness. And it's the goal of, of the mystical, traditions, like Zen, Kabbalah, Christian mysticism. And I suppose if you wanted to summarize that kind of state, it's being one with God. So compared to that is the kind of state I've referred to as the interactive relational one. The sense of self is maintained. You willfully interact with the concepts and images that are found in this state. And that's more typical of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible prophetic state. And you're being with God. You're interacting with God, as opposed to becoming one with God. So far, so good? Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, it's a lot, but, just put your thinking caps on. And, this is a smart group. The models. So what is the nature of the DMT world? Is it real or unreal? Is it inner or outer? Is it objective or is it subjective? And so also, what is it good for? Other than, it's interesting. It's unlike anything else you'll ever see. But still, what's it good for? Other than, I guess, convincing you that, there is, something else than this. So the first, three models I'll be discussing, I'll propose the unreality of the DMT state. The first one is the brain biology model, neurotheology. It's your brain on drugs. DMT, generates, the visions and the voices. And, things are configured that way in order to, to bestow evolutionary advantage, to people that have those kinds of experiences. You might be more altruistic. You might be more empathic or compassionate. You might be more creative. The other model, which posits, the unreality of the state is, the psychological model. It's your mind on drugs rather than your brain on drugs, and it's, symbolic representation of unconscious mental processes or, contents, and the state exists in order, to heal. So I was trained in the Zen, sect of Buddhism. I don't know, much about the Tibetan, sects. So in my speaking about, Buddhism, I'll be speaking about Zen. I studied and trained under the supervision of a, Western order for over 20 years. And it was quite influential in my DMT work. We supervised, sessions, kind of, from a Zen, sitting position, or mental attitude anyway, mental sitting. It was mostly hands-off, and if it, but if we needed to be, more active, we were there like that. Also, Buddhism was quite instrumental in my developing a new questionnaire for the DMT state. It was based on the skandhas of the Abhidharma school of psychology, categorizing all mental experiences through a number of discrete categories. So also, Zen influenced my, feelings about, what the ultimate, goal was going to be of a high dose of DMT. I expected it would be like the enlightenment state, like a Kensho experience, merging with emptiness, non-verbal, non-imageful, non-relational. So the Zen approach to, and also, Zen was important, just because of, my relationships with the monks and the lay people in the community, because if there weren't, if it weren't for psychedelics, I don't think there'd be any Western Buddhism. All of the monks at that monastery in their early 20s tripped on acid. They got a totally different view of things, and they said, I wonder if there's some, way to apply the insights I glimpsed, to integrate the experience, to make it more part of my life. And, for them, they chose the Zen approach. So there were, a number of, ways in which, Zen was quite influential. But their response, or their concept of the visions and the voices it's your mind-brain complex on drugs, and they are the mental detritus that are being shed on the way towards the formless, enlightened state, and they're best ignored, and also not objectively real. So the model that I propose, towards the end of my first DMT book, is what one might call soft, neurotheology. In other words, as a result of brain chemistry, changes, your consciousness is now able to perceive things which are normally invisible but objectively real, such as dark matter and parallel universes. And also it would provide the ability to interact with and apprehend the contents of those parallel sorts of worlds, ongoing parallel levels of ongoing reality. So that proposes the reality of the DMT world. So shamanism also proposes the reality of the DMT beings and the DMT world. And specifically, specifically, for goals, like for healing, for harming, locating lost objects, for the benefit of the community. So in comparing, religious models and, scientific models, concerning, the nature of the DMT world, they're both interested in these previously invisible worlds, and also they provide mechanisms by which to understand what's happening. So one of the advantages of the religious models is that they suggest why things are configured in this way, like a purpose, as it were. It's a reflection of a higher order of intelligence or wisdom or will. Also, the religious, models extract, meaning, from the state, as opposed to only information. And, so that could include, things like ethics and morality, theology. Also, they, as compared to, scientific models, are concerned with the crucial issue of integration, of applying and integrating the information one is able to extract from the psychedelic state, or from any spiritual experience. Okay, so in speaking about different religious models, I'm kind of talking, concerning these things to people interested in, the religious applications, or the religious qualities of these experiences, as opposed to the creative or the artistic or the or for pleasure or for fun, or for occult purposes, or what have you. So this is more geared towards people who think about these things within the context of their spiritual attributes and their own spiritual growth. So each of them has got strengths, and each of them has got weaknesses. So I talked about Zen briefly. The two drawbacks, when you're looking at the DMT state and you talk to people that have experienced DMT, The problem, with the Zen, model is, first of all, the DMT experiences isn't anything like a Kensho or an enlightenment, at least, the ultimate state. And also, the visions and, the voices are, considered unreal. So the other, model, which is making inroads other than Buddhism is Latin American shamanism. And, that's got, the advantage of, positing, the DMT, world as real. But it's got some ethical, moral challenges. And I think, that's, primarily because of its occult kind of roots. It's interested in, controlling these powers and, harnessing the energies, for personal use. So they're both non-Western as well. They're non-theistic, and their scope, their ethical scope, isn't like a Western ethical scope. And this afternoon, over lunch, we were talking about one's own traditions, and I think there's a resonance between these experiences and our own biology and our own culture and our own psychology, which doesn't quite hold with foreign imports, as it were. We just have a lot more of a history, biologically, energetically, with our own tradition. And if we're going to get, and if, we're going to develop a model which has got the maximal traction for the maximal amount of people, especially in the West, I think it needs to be couched or, conceived of or, kind of, garbed in, Western terms that as many people as possible can relate to. Okay. So that being said, if we're going to be looking at a spiritual, model for the DMT state, it needs to be interactive relational. It needs to, posit the effects as entering into a, world that's as real or more real than everyday reality, and it, needs to be kind of, based in terms that as many people as possible can relate to. Okay, so take a breath. I'm going to start talking about the Hebrew Bible and God and prophecy. So put on your open-minded caps and take off your anti-God, anti-Bible, anti-Israel caps. And think about these things with as open point of view as you can. It's quite heady stuff, and the first version of this talk was really abstract and theological, and I fell asleep while I was giving the talk. So I think if I can kind of alternate between my own journey into this world and the more abstract ideas, that might keep your attention. So a number of years ago, almost 20 years ago, I published an article in Tricycle magazine about sitting for sessions, and it was about the relationship between Buddhism and my DMT work. And that was the end of my relationship with my Zen community. Ultimately, they just couldn't see the two being discussed in the same breath. So parting roots, or parting ways. I went back to my roots. And I stumbled upon this book called The Kabbalah of Envy by a Portuguese rabbi named Nilton Bonder. And it was a small little book, and it completely blew my mind. I was as impressed with his stories and his logic and his train of thought as I was the first time I read Buddhist sutras. Like, it opened up an entire new way of looking at the world. And there was one story in the book in particular about an argument between a couple of farmers about tools. kind of lend you this, will you borrow that, will you break it? I'm a better man than you if I lend you this, because you won't lend it to me. So it was Jewish, but it was still, it was an extremely, refined way of, looking at interactions. And it was a spiritual approach, because the way, that you, lend, something to someone or you borrow something from somebody can be played out at every level possible. At the interpersonal, at the psychological, the cultural, the anthropological, between states, between markets, between the spiritual, world and yourself. So it, discussed, things of great import, of a, vast perspective, but at a, truly intimate level, on the interactions between you and somebody else, arguing about a tool. So I was thinking, well, where did this come from? And so I was interested in, finding out, what his, sources were. And, the primary one was the Hebrew Bible. So it was back to the Hebrew Bible, which I had, kind of, turned my back on, 40 years, hence. So let's do some Hebrew Bible 101. It's a collection of 22 books written in you biblical Hebrew. It's not Kabbalah. Kabbalah is a later development. Kabbalah is kind of mystical. You try to, you merge with God. There's the white light and those kinds of things. And if you just are staying within the confines of the Hebrew Bible, it isn't mystical at all. It's extremely gritty. It's interactions, and there's no mystical experiences described at all, or mystical unitive experiences. They're all interactive, relational. So I started reading the Bible, for personal reasons. I mean, I felt bad. My Buddhist community kicked me out. So I still liked, to read spiritual things. So, okay, here's the Bible. It's kind of a funny story, but plus I was curious, what's in the Hebrew Bible? It's an awfully popular book. And also, last but not least, I was interested in, perhaps developing a, different model for my DMT work. So the prophetic state, most people think about, the prophetic state or, prophecy, like as, foretelling or predicting, but that's an artifact of the Greek translation of the word for prophet in Hebrew. If you look at, the root of the, if you look at the root of the word in the Hebrew Bible, it can be translated as an interpreter, or a translator, or a spokesperson. But the Greeks were interested in foretelling, and they entered spiritual states in order to foretell, so-called divination. So when the Greeks were, translating the Hebrew Bible into Greek, which was the first, non-Hebrew language, they translated the word prophetes, which means to speak before something happens. So that's the reason that the concept became associated with foretelling and predicting. So I define it more generically. It's any spiritual experience that's obtained by any character in the Hebrew Bible. So that could be the canonical prophets like Isaiah or Ezekiel. It could be like a herdsman whose name you'll never know. But it's any experience of, visions and voices, inspiration, any kind of out-of-body experience. So to read the Hebrew Bible is not easy. It's a very tough nut to crack, let me tell you. So there are some, ways to enter into it. And one of the ways is to read it out loud, especially in Hebrew, if you've got the patience to teach yourself biblical Hebrew. But any good English, translation will do. There's a certain, resonance, between the spoken, voice and the words and your brain and your spirit that I think are, well, they're optimally activated when you read out loud. And if you really study the book, carefully, once you've read it through a number of times, you begin entering into a specific state, like it's an altered state, which was very curious. So you're kind of, resonating with the state out of which, the text emerged. And it's a prophetic text, so you're kind of entering into a prophetic altered state. It's quite hard, to read, the Bible without, the commentators. Most of the commentators, lived in the Middle Ages, and they just go, through the text, verse by verse, word by word, and they explain what's going on. And once you've got some good, commentaries, by your side, as you're going through the text, they'll explain, what you're reading, and they kind of, provide, the sitting, for the altered state, which is induced from study. Yeah, so if you want to, get a, sense of the, psychedelic quality of, some of the visions in the Hebrew Bible, the first chapter of Ezekiel is pretty DMT-like. Well, so the heavens open, and and he saw visions, a stormy wind, he was being blown around. There was a, great cloud, flashing fire, brilliance all around, lightning, and, beings emerged, from the fire with a number of different, faces. They ran to and fro without their legs moving. Their backs and wings were full of eyes. The beings were flying through space. The sound of the wings, the expanse over their heads like blue sapphire or like a rainbow. It's just too much for Ezekiel, and he just falls down. And so the angel picks him back up and starts speaking to him. Pulls him by the hair, carries him through space. What could be more DMT-like? Well, yeah, so one of the, we have to kind of, wonder about, the power of, the Bible. And I think it's because it's a prophetic text. It's like a spiritual text, which, came out of a specific state. And I think that state has a tremendous amount of power. Look at all of you, because you're here, because of, the psychedelic state. And there's, clearly an overlap between the psychedelic and the prophetic state. And the staying power, the influence of the text, I think, relates, to it being a description of spiritual experience of a certain type. So one new category I came up with when I was comparing the two states, like I spent maybe 3 years, looking, through the Bible over and over and over again, and bending the descriptions in the Bible into the categories I had developed, using the skanda system, for the DMT state, like perception, cognition, emotion, those kinds of things. So in the description of Ezekiel falling on his face, was that? Well, so that's a physical effect. So I would bend that description into physical effect. But after a while, it didn't. In making that comparison, it didn't quite seem like I was capturing all of the similarities or the differences. And so I developed a new concept called relatedness, which then started to tease apart or make clearer the difference between the DMT and the prophetic states. Because the quality of the relatedness was much more highly articulated in the descriptions of the prophetic experience as compared to the descriptions of the relatedness that my DMT volunteers brought back. So it's a means of communicating, and primarily verbal. when you're in, the DMT state, there is an attempt, by the beings to communicate. And, one of the, common complaints of the volunteers is they couldn't quite understand what the beings were saying to them. Either they were too anxious, or they didn't understand the language, or it was too soft. So, one of the, things, that you'll see in the Hebrew Bible is, that it's, mostly verbal communication. There are clearly visions, but the visions either represent some verbal message, or are just intended to get the attention of the prophet in order to start speaking with him. So if you start to, so when you begin to do deep study of the text, it is an altered state, and it is stimulated by, and it resonates, with, the visions and the voices and the feelings. But I think more importantly, it, resonates, with the message of this state. It's as if you're being spoken to about, something that's quite, fundamental, as opposed to just, seeing things which are amazing and unusual. So the state itself is kind of like a discovery and, like a recognition, but it's an abstract one. So it isn't especially perceptual. It's more, cognitive, intellectual, rational. But still, it's hard to put your finger on. And so in an attempt to put my finger on it, it, seemed as if, one's intellect establishes a, relationship with the non-perceptual features of the psychedelic experience. So this is one of the most important points I want to make, is, when you're tripping, there are these visions, but there's also this, sense of knowing, something new. You're kind of getting something that you've never gotten before. And that's an intellectual apprehension. That's not a perceptual apprehension. So when you're reading the Hebrew Bible, you start to get a glimpse of what that intellectual apprehension might possibly be that you're glimpsing in the psychedelic state. Or that's kind of how I started to to conceptualize it. Yeah, so you're kind of, in a way closing in on God's mind. If, the text is a prophetic text and prophecy is communication between us and, the divine, then you're getting into or approaching, the mind of divinity. So I, kind of like this. It's got some advantages. Compared, to the current models. I'm sorry? Okay. Yeah, it will kind of, it will place, words around the, fundamental information which is only hinted at or intimated at or alluded to in the perceptual and the emotional components of the psychedelic experience. So it's a verbal experience. It's an abstract experience. You can't really draw it. You can't sing it. But you can understand it. I think one guy, yeah. But that was, kind of a, it wasn't a recurring, feature, yeah. Yeah, so, if you are then able to start to understand the text as, kind of a specific way of approaching the psychedelic state, then it adds a dimension. To the experience, like on top of the emotions and the perceptions. So we can think about it, and we can talk about it. It isn't ineffable anymore. Everything's ineffable. But some things are more ineffable than others. So if you can make it less ineffable, I think you've got like a head start. As opposed to saying you can't talk about it, you can say, well, you can talk about it, and it's kind of like this and it's kind of like that. There's one God, and there's intermediaries, and there's providence, and there's reward and punishment. So how does that kind of manifest within your own psychedelic experience? Let's say. So it isn't that you're purely remembering a sense or a feeling that you had back then. You've got more to take home and to chew on and to write about and to think about, to converse with your colleagues and friends with. So the phenomenology is one thing, but the phenomenology kind of expresses the message. It's like a symbolic representation of the message, and the message is more verbal in the prophetic text, and so that makes you wonder. Can the Hebrew Bible, which is a spiritual text describing a DMT-like world, help us extract information from the DMT state? So what is the prophetic message? Well, it mostly has to deal with the nature of reality and how to relate to it, the highest possible manner, to do the least harm and do the most good. So this is kind of just there. So the prophetic state is an interaction between the person and either God or God's angels, God's intermediaries. One of the interesting things about the prophetic experience too is it is verbal, intrinsically verbal, as opposed to the enlightenment state, which is intrinsically nonverbal. Like when Moses was on the top of the mountain and received the Ten Commandments, those were words. So the peak of his experience as a prophet was verbal, as opposed to coming down from your kensho or your enlightenment, and then deriving teachings or ethical beliefs like after the fact. Like if there is no so if things are impermanent and there is no self, then specific things follow. Like you should be kind, you should give charity, you should be a doctor, you should be patient, that kind of thing. But with respect to the Bible's state, it's a purely verbal message. So it's part and parcel. So the two main teachings of the Bible have to do with God and the Golden Rule. And when you're thinking about God, so when I was thinking about God, I had a hard time with that. Like, what's a God? And, is, God like a man with a beard who is in heaven and gets mad and throws lightning bolts if you do something wrong? But that was, kind of the way I used to believe when I was 6. But I had, been through a lot, and especially all that Buddhist, training was quite helpful in providing me a, toehold for understanding God. And so one of those, toeholds, was the whole concept of cause and effect. So cause and effect, teaches that everything has a beginning, exists, and then drops off, and then stops existing. So I thought one of those questions which are not conducive to enlightenment, which is what came before cause and effect. If everything begins, exists, and ends, then, cause and effect must have begun, exists, and then ends. So I began to, mull over, could you, think about a creator of cause and effect, something which, established, the law of cause and effect. That both created the law of cause and effect and also sustains it, like at every moment. Because cause and effect can end any time, and it can end right now. So it's got to be sustained. So I then started to think, that could be one definition of God, is the creator and the sustainer of cause and effect. So if you look at the concept that way, you could look at God as both existing before cause and effect and also after cause and effect. So it isn't contained within space or time, but it created space or time, and space or time are within God, as opposed to God, being within space and time. So if you have somebody or something that's created something, that explains why there is something as opposed to nothing, and it also can explain why things are the way they are. So the natural laws are self-evident in a lot of ways anyway. You can study them carefully, objectively, but the moral laws also follow the law of cause and effect. So that also kind of sprung from my contemplation of Buddhist ideas, because cause and effect didn't seem morally neutral. They seemed to encourage certain behaviors and discourage others. Like for example, I was hiking one day and I was angry at somebody and I was plotting revenge, and I stubbed my toe, and I thought, well, that's kind of painful. So I thought, well, that's strange. Why didn't my plotting revenge, make me, turn into a refrigerator? But instead, I stubbed my toe. So I thought, well, that's cause and effect. And there's all this, psychology, my unconscious, those kinds of things. But that just explains how it works, rather than why things are set up that way. So that also, got me, thinking about, God as the creator of natural law and moral law. They both, kind of devolve from the same source. And they both reflect a specific kind of intelligence, certain kind of will. So one more concept that gets people's ire up is the notion of reward and punishment. Like if you do good, you'll be rewarded, and if you do bad, you'll be punished. But that's purely an anthropomorphic interpretation of cause and effect, as opposed to saying my stubbing my toe was the end result of a cosmically vast chain of cause and effect. I could say, God didn't really, design humans to continue being angry. They were going to be, punished and discouraged from being angry and plotting revenge. But it's, the same thing. It's just a different way of describing it or, calling it something else. Okay, so thanks. Well, so prophecy meets the DMT state. Well, they're both interactive and relational. They both propose that the state is more real than real. Both of the states are full of beings, and they both contain information. One is more or less verbal than the other. Can you wait? Yeah. So I came up with a new model to kind of counterbalance the neurotheology model. And, this is what I call theoneurology. Which is kind of a top-down model, as opposed to the bottom-up neurotheological model. So hopefully people will think about it and begin developing it, and hopefully it will integrate theistic and materialistic models. So it will include both rigor and wisdom. And ultimately, it's based on medieval metaphysics, from Maimonides in particular, and it proposes mostly or more or less that the activation of our intellect and our imagination takes place by God. So the activation of our imagination is responsible for the contents of the state, the visions and the voices. And the activation of our intellect, then allows us to extract the meaning, from those visions and those voices. So this proposes that God created the brain in order to communicate with us, as opposed to the bottom-up, model, which proposes that the brain generates the impression of God communicating with us. It isn't brain reflex. It's just a mechanism by which divine communication occurs. So one could speculate that increases of endogenous DMT activity could possibly mediate the visions and the voices, the contents of the state. Because there really isn't any evidence in the text of plants being used for their psychoactive effects. There's some theories, like, the manna and ergot alkaloids, the cannabis and the incense, but it's a lot easier to propose it's, just a naturally occurring elevation. But, you have to also, think about what's the mechanism. So one can become, qualified for prophecy. So you train your intellect in order to be able to extract, meaning from the visions. Classically, one would, increase, the power, train the intellect through study of, the classic, fields, sciences, art, grammar, scripture, astronomy, music. So within so within the present context or within the present discussion, you could think about stimulating or activating, the imagination, through DMT or, similar psychedelics. Also, there are specific, technologies which, may, turn out to be responsible for increasing naturally occurring levels of DMT, which are, characterized in the text in like fasting, prayer, song, sensory isolation, those kinds of things. So those could, theoretically increase, levels of endogenous DMT activity. But ultimately, the arbiter of, the, contents of the visions and the capacity to extract information from them, in the context of, in the context of, this model, is divinity, as opposed, to the ultimate, arbiter, being ourselves. Oops. Well, so being qualified still, isn't enough to become a prophet. You have to be in, the right place and the right person, the right time, and, the right need. The divine determination of the content and the interpretation. So, one could conceive of divine influence alone being responsible for increasing DMT activity. It's, what's called efflux or overflow, divine overflow. That's a medieval term. So that could, theoretically increase activity of DMT. So just smoking DMT does not make you a prophet. That's what I want to say. DMT does not a prophet make. So about 2,000 years ago, the rabbis declared an end to prophecy, and that was kind of hard to describe or to countenance from a biological point of view. There's nothing biological that happened 2,000 years ago, and spiritually it's kind of a crapshoot too, because if you become qualified for prophecy and there still is a need, then you have to resort to the miracle of withholding of prophecy within a qualified person. So that's kind of a stretch. So ultimately, I think it was a political decision, because prophets are rabble rousers, they're persecuted, nobody likes them, and, the Romans were occupying Judea at the time, Christianity was coming up and competing with, Judaism, so, the rabbis just kind of, closed ranks and said there's no more prophecy, it's all in the text. And, that was true, but it also kind of, marginalize the prophetic experience, even though the rabbis themselves, continue to partake, and the more mystical, sects of Judaism over, the millennia, continue to have, their own prophetic experiences. So, there are two, the information in, the text kind of discusses my relationship with the spiritual world and the relationship, with everything else, so to speak. And, so there's the one God, the divine, source of everything we seek at the highest level. And it's the thing we wish to be loved, by and to love and to know and to be known by. So you can intimate that within the psychedelic state. But if you've got the focus like, okay, the most ultimate thing to be loved by and to love is this, and the most ultimate thing to be known by and to know is this. It can help with your focus, if you're able to focus. Okay, so the other aspect of the message of the text is relating to everything else other than the spiritual world, and so that's the golden rule, which is in Leviticus, and the golden rule in the Hebrew Bible is different than the golden rule in the Christian Bible. In the Hebrew Bible, it's a little more elevated, it's a little more idealistic, I suppose. Love your neighbor as yourself, as opposed to as opposed to treating others as you would like to be treated. So this speaks about love, for example, rather than narcissism or self-servingness. I don't want to start a sectarian war, but that's just my impression. So the world to come is quite interesting. It's kind of alluded to in the later prophets like Isaiah, Joel, and Amos. That group, and they speak about this thing called the end of days, or the end of history, or the end of the world, and it's incorporeal. If you read the descriptions, so nobody dies, nobody gets sick. It's almost as if you're able to occupy the same space as somebody else, and it's quite DMT-like. Like the heavens rip, the mountains melt, things like that. So I've kind of developed this crackpot theory that it could be a description of what would happen if the genetic apparatus for DMT synthesis was turned on in every organism that possessed it at the same time. It would almost be like a biological description of the rapture. And there's all kinds of fiendish schemes one could come up with along those lines, like putting the DMT activating gene in a common cold virus and release it, and those kinds of things. But you can speed up the world to come, apparently. In the text, they say, in its time I will hasten it. So it's got a prearranged time, and if it never happens, it's going to happen. But we're encouraged, to bring the world to come on. I'm sorry? We can talk about that maybe after. Okay, yeah. Or I guess when I'm signing books too. Okay, so the implications are interesting. If you study the Bible, you like the Bible, and you want to go deeper into the Bible, and you're not able to, you could think about the prudent application of a psychedelic or DMT state, or experience, which would occasion a state with features which are common to those in the prophetic text. Applicable within the field of clinical spirituality research, which is happening around the country and the world. The study at Hopkins giving psilocybin is including clerics now, so there will be some empirical validation of that idea. And I think more relevant to this group is the Hebrew Bible influencing psychedelia, the understanding and integration of this of the psychedelic drug state. There's a number of ways of doing that. Once you know the text and you know some of the concepts, for example, the beings, you could look at the beings as angels, and the figures in the Bible interact with angels all the time. They're asking them questions. They're determining if they're friendly or harmful. So you can learn to interact with the beings in a different way, based on your understanding of the interactions of the prophetic figures with the angels. And you can also, instead of opening up to love or being mindful or letting go, you could pray. You could pray to God, for help, as opposed to letting go or feeling love or those kinds of things. It's a more it's more of an interactive way of dealing with the psychedelic state. If you're in a tight spot, you could pray. you could pray to something, which isn't you, because it isn't all you. You can also apply, some of the, content of the text, to the psychedelic state, like the golden rule, the one God, those kinds of things. When you're wondering what you're seeing in a DMT experience, or you're, wondering what kind of information is being transmitted, if you've got some, familiarity, with these notions, that can help you make, sense of what you're seeing sometimes. Sitting also, there's some applications. There's a, figure in the Hebrew Bible named Elisha, who's just a wild man of a prophet. And there was a character, so there is a therapist in the Bay Area named Leo Zeff. So he would kind of lay on you if you're having a hard time, like face to face, palm to palm, chest to chest, abdomen to abdomen, upper legs to upper legs, lower legs to lower legs. And it seemed pretty extreme, but people would say it was the only thing that's which kept me in one piece. And if you look in the book of Judges, there's this there's this character whose name is Elisha, and he's called to resurrect a dead child, and he lays on the dead child, face to face, chest to chest, abdomen to abdomen, palm to palm, and the child revives. So Leo passed away maybe 10, 15 years ago. But if he were still alive, I'd be really interested, where he got that idea. Okay, so hopefully I've, covered or been influenced by those guiding principles, like if, so what, and we must at the very least enlarge the discussion about psychedelics. Okay, so email me for the slides. Thanks. Yay. Thank you. Well, thanks. Well, the last time I gave a talk was, 5 years ago, and man, it was in New York, and people were really edgy about this. So, I've developed my ideas and the way to present them a little better. Yes. Well, can we be quiet so I can hear questions? Yeah. I was interested in. Oh yeah. So the question was, how I got interested in DMT. So I was always interested in, the biological bases of spiritual experience. So I began with, looking at the pineal gland and melatonin. Gave a lot of melatonin to people, and it was, pretty mild. And in the meantime, I learned about DMT, and changed my focus. Yes. Yeah. So the question is, are there any kind of geophysical things that activate the pineal gland or activate DMT synthesis? There are some data about melatonin synthesis being turned on by EMFs or turned off by EMFs. I'm not that current on the melatonin literature, but I haven't come upon anything with respect to increases of levels of DMT in response to EMFs or gravitational fields or ley lines or those kinds of things. It's extremely difficult, to measure levels of DMT in the body. The concentrations are in the order of 1/1000th of a gram per milliliter. So we're not quite able to, measure endogenous levels yet. We're, I would say within a few years, but, only if you take DMT, we can measure those levels. But naturally occurring, levels are still too low to measure. I think ultimately we're going to be looking at the genetic apparatus, for example, in the retina, the pineal, or in the lungs. If you're exposed to, high power. If you're exposed to high power, kinds of EMFs, does that turn on the gene, as opposed to that increasing levels of DMT in the blood. Max. Yeah, it's possible. Well, every few months I'll get an email from somebody with the subject line, "Your book and my son." Yeah. Well, it's a story of some kid who's walking around with my DMT book and just smoking his brains out, and they get psychotic and they end up in the prison system. Yeah, if you're careful, if you're prepared, if you're in good health, physically and mentally, but still, Terence McKenna used to say that one's hand is always shaking lighting the pipe. Like every time you light the pipe, your hands are shaking because you just don't know what's going to happen. So, in my study, we screen people very carefully. And, a couple of people had some pretty bad experiences and were kind of in a bad way for a couple of weeks, couple of months. We kept a close eye on them and, kind of got them, back on their feet and back to baseline. But, it's a completely, it's a completely unusual, novel experience. And, you're taking some risk by exposing yourself to it. Yeah, and you just can't really predict what's going to happen. Like I would give DMT and the person would just be laying there. And I just had no idea, what was going to, be the first, things out of their mouth. Like it was great, or I was being anally raped by crocodiles. You just have no idea, so, yeah. You kind of, do your best and hope for the best. Yeah. Yeah, I've not really come across any. It's interesting. Ralph Abraham, the mathematician in our DMT documentary, like he smoked a quarter pound of DMT in a year in the 1960s. And one day he came up to me and he said, "Rick, do you think I damaged my brain from smoking this much DMT?" And he's the smartest guy I've ever met in my life. He'll end up winning a Nobel Prize probably. So. I don't, see any evidence. If you're, kind of marginally compensated, epilepsy, schizophrenia, you don't want to, kind of stress your brain any more than need be. But, it's got, quite a good safety profile. It'll increase your heart rate and blood pressure. So if you have heart disease and whatnot, but the neurotoxic effects, they seem to be minimal. Yes. In the blue T-shirt.
Yeah, I was wondering if you've done or know of any research if there are DMT in any other creatures other than the mammalian family?
Like sponges or fish or whatnot?
Or anything that you know of, any research you know of?
Yeah, there's some evidence about certain fish, certain sponges, quite a few plants, obviously. Well, the concentrations are just, are quite low and hard to measure. But, quite a few people also contact me and they say, I get to the same place with meditation, or I get to the same place with hypnagogic things, or lucid dreaming. And, they describe some pretty DMT like experiences. So I've got a kind of a stock answer that, To the extent, that a non-drug state resembles that brought on by giving DMT, there's got to be something, comparable going on biologically. Yes. You, yeah.
Do you know if there's any considerable difference between taking DMT in a normal state of consciousness versus like at the peak of a meditative state of consciousness or in a sensory deprivation state?
Well, I don't think there have been studies done, but there's, there is a large amount of, of stories, anecdotal data, as it were. People smoking, DMT as, they're peaking on LSD. People smoking DMT in a tank, like an isolation tank. I've not heard of people smoking DMT as they're meditating, but I'm sure it's being done as we speak. Yeah, yeah. But I haven't, seen any papers, let's say, peer-reviewed scientific literature.
So we hear that DMT, God can use DMT to communicate with humans and whatnot. But since the end of prophecy, is that state after that time period, is that not of God or is that some other place?
Right. Yeah. Well, there still is, prophetic experience. It is being, marginalized, but your question, raises the issue, if prophecy ended and, God's attempting to communicate with us through DMT, what is occurring? So there's this whole issue of false prophecy. So, it's kind of a sophisticated issue, but, if you're just kind of, tripping out on yourself, let's say, that could be a, form of false prophecy. It can look divine, sound divine, but if it's just, being generated from your own personality, let's say, and it's quite hard to tell what's what. The gold standard for the criteria is it consistent with the one God and the golden rule, and anything which countervenes that is called false prophecy, and even if it's spoken by a true prophet, so it gets kind of complicated. I guess, one of the things I'm keen on is, kind of rejuvenating the prophetic tradition. So, even if, prophecy ended, that, doesn't mean we can't work on rejuvenating it or bringing it, back to life. So that's one of the reasons that I'm putting this, theory out there. It'll also speed the world to come, I believe, which will be a very nice place. Yes.
Prior to doing your studies, did you have a personal reference point for DMT? And the second part of the question is, given the constraints of doing a formal study the way you had to do, how do you assess the impact of the constraints, medical setting, muscular injection rather than vaporization, these kind of things?
Yeah. Well, the first question I just never answer. Yeah, I mean, why? Guess. So the second question, is, the constraints of, the medical setting. And, it was the worst and the best possible place to take DMT. There's people on the ward, getting experimental chemotherapy, puking, dying. There's plumbing. There's crash carts walk up and down the hall. But there were, airplanes, flying overhead. So I would, kind of wait for a window of quiet on the ward before giving the DMT. And I'll tell you, once the study got underway, you wouldn't believe how many people said, "I'm so glad I'm in the hospital." Because if anything horrible happened, they could just be taken care of like that. Yeah. So like on top of that, they were completely wired, with an IV in one arm, an IV in another arm, and they were completely helpless. They just could not resist. They were completely, wired. So they just gave up. They gave up like a half hour before the study started. They said, "Okay, I'm all yours," and it was true. They couldn't move. They were just almost tied down, but not really. So I think that helped too. It kind of encouraged that letting go, that sense of going inward, that sense of, well, I'm really in it. There's no escape. I think ultimately that was helpful. So we gave it intravenously, not intramuscularly. Yeah, it was a little faster than smoked. Yeah. Yes.
So I know that they say with a lot of like psilocybin studies that have been done, and they say that it generates new brain growth and new brain cell development.
Right.
As far as DMTs, has there been any studies done as far as what that causes as far as future development in the brain, or I guess if it's a catalyst for it?
Yeah. Well, I've got a couple answers to that. The first is there's very few DMT studies taking place, and I wish that weren't the case. There was one, German study that came out in English in 2005, 10 years after I stopped, my work. And it was a very interesting study. They gave a continuous infusion of IV DMT, like for 2-3 hours, and compared it with a continuous infusion of ketamine. It was the, psychotomimetic model. They were looking at, if you give DMT, is it like schizophrenia or not? And if you give ketamine, is it like schizophrenia or not? But human studies, that's it with pure DMT. Like there was mine and there was hers. And you can't get any information from her about what happened to her volunteers. They were normal volunteers, but she stopped doing that research. She said the Germans were discouraging experimental studies like that. So I think something weird went down, and she just doesn't want to talk about it. So it's a crying shame that there's not more human DMT studies taking place. There's ayahuasca research in Spain, but there's no pure DMT studies. I just received an email this afternoon from a group in the UK that's doing those LSD and psilocybin studies, and they're, gearing up to do a study of DMT. So, I was encouraged to hear that. In terms of the brain genetics or cellular effects of DMT, that's not really been worked out that much. There's a Hungarian group and a Wisconsin group, that are looking at the relationship between, the sigma site and, DMT. They seem to be expressed at the same time and next to each other, physically. So there could be, some relationship, between the sigma site, which is where, PCP and ketamine act, and, DMT, synthesis in, nerve cells. But it's but the field's in its infancy, and we just need a lot more research. Yes.
So you said something about opening the mind and dark matter and other parts of the universe that can't normally happen. Is there any reason, or what's the thought behind that makes you think that we might actually be interacting with something real rather than internal?
Well, are you asking about? Are you asking? Why not only view it as a product of the brain, as opposed to, yeah. Yeah. Well, I think I feel that way because of how it seems. It just seems that way. That it seems real. One of our volunteers, put it quite nicely. Like he came in for some DMT work, then came back a month later for some more DMT work. And he said, it isn't like I'm returning to the same place. I'm returning, to that place which has gone on for the last month, and I'm just dipping back into it. So experientially, it has the hallmarks of something real, and as a thought experiment. Well, if it were something real, then how could that possibly happen? So that's when I started speculating about ways in which it might be real. Like it was a thought experiment, and I was looking around for scientific explanations of the reality of the DMT state. There are normally invisible, worlds passing through us at all times. And it seems like that is a good fit. It might not be true. If you could develop like a dark matter camera and take pictures of what's there and then come back and compare it to the DMT description, that'd be great. time to develop a dark matter camera. Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. It's a huge leap. Yeah. But still, so next week there's going to be a small meeting in England of some big thinkers, and they're going to start working on a competition to the person who can prove the objective reality of the DMT beings. And some physicists are going to be there, some mathematicians are going to be there, brain scientists. So as crazy an idea as it is, yeah, it's going to be north of London. Yeah. Let's see. Okay, you.
So you were talking essentially about DMT, like in a religious model, but then you're coming from a science background and you're talking about a lot of science studies. What do you feel that science is necessary to understand religion? Or I guess more broadly, just like for what is for you, the relationship between science and religion?
Well, I think, so religion ends, so religion sort of starts, where science ends, in a lot of ways, but I think they can overlap as well. One of the advantages of, science is the peer review. There's really isn't much, peer review within, the religious, traditions, which is, one of the reasons of its, being abused, for so many thousands of years. So if you've got, the open discussion of your data, and, peer review to kind of, judge the merit of an argument, based on established, methodologies of, testing, retesting, and refining your theory. I think that would benefit religion. It would bring some rigor to it, which I think it lacks. And science, I think it kind of ends at a certain point. Like the ethical and the purposeful, reasons for things being the way they are. It isn't in their charge. They're just not that interested in it, and one ought not to expect it. So religions, I think, can help with that kind of an overlay. Well, does that, somewhat answer your question?
I mean, I guess if you feel that religion kind of starts where science ends, then kind of why science? Why not just go straight with the religious route?
Well, because religion can, you can become superstition, which is one of the things that a true, religion wouldn't, necessarily, fall into. It would be more of trying. Right. Well, superstition. Well, so superstition, primarily, feeds on hope and fear, as opposed, to the awe of what's around you and trying to understand it and get, close to God for that sake, for the sake of getting close to God, rather than the fear of being punished or the hope of, something better. Like I guess a truly religious person, really doesn't care, just because, their goals are kind of, beyond the purely personal. So why do we need science? Yeah, I think, just to keep religion in check and, to make it honest. Let's see, yes.
What do you make of the suggestions that DMT-containing plants such as Syrian blue and acacia were used in biblical times in the East?
Well, there's some support for that, but not a lot. Yeah, I don't think it really, helps explain the phenomena. It isn't described in the text, really. There's the incense, But the incense was only inhaled by a very, very small number of people. Not the prophets. The prophets weren't priests. They didn't really do the service, of, going into the temple smelling the incense and whatnot. Yeah, and, all of the group, visions that occurred in the desert didn't, necessarily occur as a result of exposure to the incense or any burning plants. Acacia, the burning bush, and Moses, that's, one experience. And, the rest of the time, Moses was, never around a burning bush. And I think you can spend a lot of time looking for plants and fungi and stuff and get a bit distracted from, the text itself and what it's, trying to convey. Okay, oh yeah. Okay, well, great, thanks.